The friction between the United States and China has just reached another milestone, and this one is much more tangible than the accusations that have been going back and forth about who's to blame for the coronavirus. Let me tell you what's going on. For the first time, China has expelled and actively denounced the U.S. for what it calls the illegal trespass of a warship off the Shisha Islands. It doesn't stop there, though. China is now putting the United States on notice that it's willing and capable to defend itself, and then suggested that the United States should put aside its, quote, Cold War mentality and take time instead to test and quarantine its sailors from further spread of COVID-19. Those are China's words. Now, this is a further escalation of the South China Seas controversy, so let me help you visualize this, okay? Let's do this. Let's go over to the map where I'm going to show you. First of all, let's start by explaining where this Shisha Island is, because most people look at this and they're starting to wonder where we're talking about. It's right over here. This is part of the Paracel Islands. By the way, these islands are tiny, so it's not like we could even show them on the map if we wanted to. This one's off the coast of Vietnam. A little further south, these are the Spratly Islands. So these are the Paracel Islands, these are the Spratly Islands. This whole area is filled with these islands in here, and most of them are contested. The entire area is called the South China Sea. That's the point of contention. China says that whole area belongs to them because they say it's always belonged to them. They say they have proof that its people sailed these waters thousands and thousands of years ago. And then since World War II, it has maintained control of these islands after Japan was defeated. But there are 5 other countries who are now claiming the waters off of the South China Sea. Why? Because they say, look, maritime law says we get ownership of anything 200 miles off of our shoreline. Those countries are the Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia and Brunei and Taiwan. Now, some of these countries that I just told you about have decent relationships with China, but some of them don't. Instead, some of these countries maintain close relationships with the United States. And the United States, for its part, has been engaging more and more in this region militarily. And that is what has China so angry. So maybe the real question here is this. What is it suddenly about the South China Sea that makes it so coveted? It contains 11 billion barrels of oil, they have found. 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. 10% of all the world's fisheries reside right here. 30% of the world's shipping trade flows through these corridors. 30%. So this is why everyone wants it. And China is doing everything it can to hold on to it. So what exactly is China doing? You know the expression, you've heard this before, right? Possession is 9/10 of the law. Well, China's putting that to practice. It's literally taking possession of these islands, and some that aren't even islands. They're just shoals, but they're turning them into islands and they're building them up. I've got an example for you. I'm going to give you an example of one of the satellite images that we're going to show you here. You see that right there? That is a runway. And what's funny about this is this used to be just a shoal, rock. Some of it was underwater, but they've built it up. I mean, this is what a remote island now looks like. And what they do is they use the fleets of the ships to go out. They dredge the ocean floor. They take out the sand. They take out the rock to make these islands bigger and higher. And then they built these runways and commercial and military establishments and buildings. The argument that they're using is, look, now we live here. We own it. And everything within 200 miles of it by maritime law. So the U.S. is accusing China, by doing this kind of stuff, of what it calls a revisionist argument. And it says that it's going to continue to deploy its Navy, the U.S. Navy, into these waters for the protection of its allies. China, meanwhile, is intensifying its threats to defend itself if the U.S. continues to send warships there. Neither side wants a hot war, obviously. Who does, right? But the sparring, as we're going to explain to you in a minute, is continually getting hotter. This is we think this is a really important story, one that we all need to keep our eyes on here on the News with Rick Sanchez, where we really do believe it's time to do news again. told you about. It's a fascinating story. The latest incident seems to have China particularly upset. It happened off the Shisha Islands, as I was showing you. And Michelle Greenstein's here. She's going to join us now to drill down on what's been happening this week. This is starting to get very, very serious. And it sounds like if China was upset before, they're even more upset now.
That's right. Well, here's what happened. On Tuesday, the USS Barry, right, a wartime U.S. naval ship, actually entered into the Paracel Islands or the Shisha Islands waters, right? China then said that it actually expelled this ship because it was trespassing illegally. But actually, there's even more. Then on Wednesday, another wartime U.S. ship, the USS Bunker Hill, actually entered into the waters around the Spratly Islands, right? So China, in response to these two back-to-back operations, is calling the United States a troublemaker and said that Barry was actually an intrusion into Chinese territorial waters. And in response to what happened at Bunker Hill, here's what the PLA said. Here's the PLA statement. These provocative acts by the U.S. side have deliberately increased regional security risks and could easily trigger an unexpected incident.
It's fascinating to see just how, what a sense of possession China has been developing over time.
Absolutely.
Is it because it feels militarily threatened, or is it because of those billions of gallons of oil that we just talked about that are sitting underneath this sea?
Well, China would say that they're actually responding, right, to U.S. efforts to militarize this. Here's what the U.S. is saying. Washington is basically saying that they don't recognize China's claims to these Paracel or the Shisha Islands, right? So to them, this is not Chinese waters. Those 30 islands that are known as the Shisha or Paracel Islands are controlled by Beijing, but they're also claimed by Taiwan and Vietnam, right, by Taipei and Hanoi.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the USS Bunker Hill, the U.S. says that this was just a freedom of navigation operation. And what that means is because these are islands that are disputed, right, claimed by China, but also by Taiwan, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, that the Navy actually came out with this statement. Here's what they had to say. This freedom of navigation operation was consistent with international law and actually meant to challenge the restrictions on innocent passage imposed by China, Vietnam, and Taiwan. So basically what the U.S. is saying is that because China is posing a threat to freedom of the seas, the United States has to respond, right? And that's what they did by moving around in these waters.
The fear is that this thing somehow is going to boil over. And now with the United States or entities in the media of the United States accusing China of the worldwide pandemic, it seems like everything is escalating, like the two stories are kind of melding into one, no?
Absolutely. Tensions are rising, and it's bringing up the age-old question, right? Because the U.S. is accusing China of militarizing the South China Sea. The China is accusing the U.S. of the same thing. In the past, of course, China has said that the U.S. uses these types of legal arguments like freedom of navigation to actually barge recklessly, they say, into their region. China, of course, claims this entire region. You know, last week, Mike Pompeo actually accused China of deploying militarized ships to intimidate other countries from starting oil and gas projects there. So it's a lot of he said, she said. China, of course, calls this just deliberate provocation.
This is really a crazy blasting point, one we really need to take a good look at. Michelle, good stuff. Thanks for bringing us the micro side of that story as we explained the macro side of that story. And now, as usual, let's do the analysis. George Galloway, former UK MP, joining us now to take this apart for us. Your impressions, George, over the top of this sudden incident that seems to be blowing up there in the South China Sea. What is it?
Well, it's eerily similar to our recent discussion about the Persian Gulf. And again, the clue is in the name. Whoever has a claim on these islands, it certainly isn't the United States of America, which is a very long way indeed from the South China Sea. Neither was the United States Navy acting on behalf of Vietnam. I don't need to remind you that this was the day in 1975 when the Vietnamese people chased the American ambassador off the roof of his embassy. Neither is the U.S. acting on behalf of Malaysia or on behalf of the Philippines. It may or may not be acting on behalf of Taiwan, but Richard Nixon made a strategic decision a very long time ago that the United States relations were with China and that there was only one China. So this is a very dangerous point that we've reached, because China, frankly, is getting tired of being insulted and pushed around. And the danger is that they will take decisive action, Rick.
That's interesting that you would say that. I'm going to just push back a little bit. What if the United States were to hold to the argument that, look, those islands were all controlled by the Japanese prior to World War II, certainly prior to the end of World War II. After we, the United States, beat the Japanese, those islands really should belong to us, right? They could make that argument. For some reason, they're not making it, but China's saying, no, it belonged to the Japanese. They lost them. We claimed them because we've had them historically. Who wins that argument, George?
Well, China lost 20 million people in the Second World War at the hands of the Japanese. 20 million. Second only to Russia in casualties in the Second World War. That won't wash because China's control of the South China Sea has been accepted for hundreds of years in international law and international practice. So it's too late to be resurrecting that, and it looks like a pretext, and it is a pretext.
George
There's
Galloway.
a trade war with China, there's a propaganda war against China, and now we've got the warships on the sea.
Yeah, and it's getting worse, and that's why we're on it, especially with these two incidents that Michelle just brought to us a little while ago. George Galloway, always a pleasure. Thank you for taking us through that. Always appreciate the